Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brendan Sargeant, Professor from the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific, and also a member of the University's Steering Group on Nuclear Technology Stewardship. Before we begin our proceedings today, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're meeting. Here in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to them and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting and working, and their elders, past, present and emerging. Your Excellency Ambassador Yamagami, distinguished panellists and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today to celebrate the launch of a timely book, Alliances, Nuclear Weapons and Escalation, edited by our scholarly colleagues, Professor Stefan Frühling and Andrew O'Neill, who have done an amazing job of bringing together subject experts from around the world who have contributed to this volume. We're delighted to today have His Excellency Shingo Yamagami, Ambassador of Japan to Australia, to join us and to officially launch the book. Ambassador Yamagami has served as Director General of Economic Affairs and of Intelligence and Analysis Service at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, as well as at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He's a graduate of the University of Tokyo and also Columbia University. We will also hear today from Dennis Richardson, distinguished panellist and former Secretary of the Department of Defence. Dennis today will reflect on the chapter in this volume contributed by our very dear colleague, Professor Brendan Sargeant, who passed away recently. From the United States, we're really delighted to welcome Oriana Mastro, who's joining us online. Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro is Centre Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, where her research focuses on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, war termination, and coercive diplomacy. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an inaugural Wilson Center China Fellow. She continues to serve in the United States Air Force Reserve, for whom she works as a strategic planner at the US Indo-Pacific Command. For her contribution to US strategy in Asia, she won the Individual Reservist of the Year Award in 2016. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce to you the editors of the new book, Professor Stefan Frühling and Andrew O'Neill. Professor Frühling is joining us online, and he is the head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Stefan has published widely on Australian defence policy, defence planning and strategy, nuclear weapons, and NATO. And finally, on the far side of our panel today is Professor Andrew O'Neill, who is Acting Dean of the Graduate Research School at Griffith University. Andrew has published widely in the broad areas of international relations and strategic studies, and is currently a chief investigator on projects focusing on the Australia-US alliance and funded by the Australian Research Council and Australia's Department of Defence. After those introductions, it's now my great pleasure to invite His Excellency Ambassador Yamagami to the podium to address us and to officially launch the book. Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Veronica, for your kind introduction. Professor Stefan Frühling, Professor Andrew O'Neill, Professor Oriana Skylar Mastro, Professor Veronica Taylor, and former Australian Ambassador to the United States, Dennis Richardson. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start my remarks by thanking the Strategic Defence and Studies Center for the opportunity to speak to you today about this new contribution to scholarship on the question of nuclear deterrence and alliance systems. With the past few weeks serving as a sobering reminder of the potential threat of the use of nuclear weapons to dictate strategic choices, to say that this book is timely might be the understatement of the year. Through the many contributions by some of the most outstanding scholars of defense and strategic policy from Japan, Australia, Europe, and the US, this book provides a much-needed analysis of what is at stake in a world where the threat of nuclear war has become more pronounced. The exploration by Professors Luring and O'Neill of the inherently political nature of escalation and extended deterrence, and what steps may be required to create a commonly accepted strategy within the Indo-Pacific to respond to great power competition, provides considerable food for thought. And as Ambassador of Japan, I did make particular note of the contributions by Professors Satake, Tsuruoka, and Murano, all of them I know, and their arguments concerning public opinion in Japan related to extended nuclear deterrence. What I should also state at this point is that the views that I will share today are my own thoughts on the questions of nuclear deterrence and alliances. So while aware of the disappointment this may come to some in the media hoping for an exclusive, I hope that you will accept these remarks in the spirit they are given. Without doubt, the specter of nuclear war has become an all too real scenario in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. While it never truly disappeared, there was hope in the aftermath of the Cold War that progress would be made on arms reduction, particularly with states that had previously not been party to control mechanisms to prevent nuclear proliferation or reduce nuclear arsenals. Yet, over the past 30 years, what we have witnessed, particularly in East Asia, is a push by emerging powers such as China to pursue larger nuclear arsenals. The US Department of Defense estimated as recently as last year that China will possess up to 700 deliverable warheads by 2027 and 1,000 by 2030. For Japan, and arguably for the region as a whole, one matter of great concern related to China's growing nuclear capability is the complete absence of any form of agreement to limit either the type or delivery systems of its nuclear arsenal. While the US and Russia ostensibly have the New START Treaty in place, at least until 2026, no similar consensus on limiting nuclear weapon numbers exists in the Indo-Pacific region. This situation is expertly addressed by various contributors to Professor Luring and O'Neill's book, particularly in the context of the potential outbreak of hostilities over Taiwan. Without any means to control the growth in nuclear arsenals among nuclear-capable states in this region, we face a dire situation, the outcome of which is near impossible to accurately predict. Yet, this dilemma is directly related to the question of deterrence. There is a distinct irony in the fact that had Ukraine not surrendered its nuclear arsenal following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia would have been much less likely to choose invasion as a means to overthrow the Ukrainian government and confront NATO. For non-nuclear states such as Japan and Australia, the choice of nuclear deterrence through alliance with the United States versus acquiring nuclear weapons themselves has a long and somewhat convoluted history, even more so in the case of Japan, with its history of being the only nation who had suffered nuclear attacks, both in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, of course. When coupled with Japan's historical advocacy for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, together with Australia, it appears to present both nations with something of a Faustian bargain. Yet, as the security environment in the region continues to grow even more severe in the face of growing belligerency from China and other authoritarian states, all norms and attitudes are being gradually cast aside as the struggle between democratic and authoritarian states is brought sharply into focus. As Professor Bruin and O'Neill so astutely put it, the old argument surrounding the binary choice of nuclear disarmament versus deterrence is a false one, which ignores the realities of strategic environments. For Japan, this is a particularly relevant point. Japan, as you are all no doubt aware, is ringed by nuclear power states, 3 of them, who have run roughshod over the rule of law. The most egregious and consistent violations of nuclear non-proliferation regulations are conducted by North Korea. To date, North Korea has already launched 11 ballistic missiles this year, only this year, for a total of 9 launches, one of which ended in failure a few weeks ago. While the world's focus has been on Ukraine, North Korea has been escalating the pace of its missile tests and has been experimenting with different types of launches. With North Korea showing no indication that it has any intention of abandoning its reckless nuclear weapons program, Japan is in the unenviable position of having to observe each missile launch while taking measures to protect ourselves from North Korea's belligerency. The reality of Japan's strategic environment means that it is inevitable that arguments for and against extended deterrence will rise to the surface from time to time. The recent public commentary by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, to the effect that Japan should possess its own nuclear weapons is a reflection of a continuing debate that has gone on for decades, but has more recently taken on a greater urgency. On the one hand, you have those calling for an overhaul of Japan's domestic legal framework to substantially modify the so-called free non-nuclear principle to neither manufacture, possess, nor permit the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japan. On the other hand, you have Japan's wartime experience, coupled with the events of March 2011 at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Both arguments have strongly influenced public opinion. The sum total of all of these views means that Japan still needs a considerable amount of discussion to reach a national consensus on extended nuclear deterrence. That is, of course, an entirely understandable situation. The only nation on earth to have suffered the tragedy of being attacked with nuclear weapons. Japan has a particular role in advocating for restraint and dialogue to replace any desire to push the nuclear button. Probably the most poignant visual representations of what devastation nuclear weapons can wreak are displayed at the Peace Museum in Hiroshima and Atomic Bomb Museum in Nagasaki. For anyone visiting Japan, a trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to see both museums is a must in order to understand what happened and why it is so important for the global community to prevent it ever happening again. When one gazes out at the modern urban landscapes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is easy to forget that the suffering that accompanied the bombings of those cities continues to this date in the form of victims of radiation poisoning and their descendants. They are a reminder of the heavy price that humanity continues to pay in pursuit of the nuclear option. We must never forget that the penalty for complacency around nuclear weapons is quite simply extinction. So, as not to end on that rather grim note, I will say that it is thanks to the work of academics such as Professor Ruling, O'Neill, and Skylar Mastro that we, particularly in democracies, can openly debate and consider what deterrence, escalation, and alliance systems mean and how they can be most effectively used to prevent the unthinkable. It is my hope that their work in this book will go a long way to informing those in positions of power on the best way forward. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador Yamagami, for those really profound remarks. Dennis, I'd now like to invite you to the podium to offer your reflection on Professor Brendan Sargeant.
Thanks, Professor, Ambassador. For those of you who did not know Brendan, he was one of Australia's great strategic thinkers, both in government and at the ANU. When I read his chapter, amongst others, but his own chapter, Australia maximising decision making and flexibility, it reminded me that he probably wrote that one morning, and in the afternoon he was probably writing poetry. He was a person of tremendous eclectic interest and taste, and he could talk about strategic policy as easily as what he could talk about subcontinental culture or indeed many other areas of life. His chapter is very typical of Brendan. Every sentence has meaning. In fact, I had to read his chapter 3 times. I literally read it 3 times because every sentence has meaning, every paragraph has meaning, and you need to get your head around it to understand where Brendan was coming from. As per the Ambassador's remarks and Brendan's chapter, a timely reminder that the issues relating to nuclear deterrence and the like have not gone away. For the last 20-odd years, we've thought about nuclear matters in terms of proliferation with a focus on Iran and North Korea. We've not thought about it in terms of other countries that have long possessed nuclear weapons, threatening others with those weapons. But we now live in a world where we know that it's possible. Brendan's chapter, I think, highlights some unfinished, some unanswered questions in terms of the management of the Australia-US alliance. It highlights the tension between operational integration and policy flexibility. We have for many years, rightly in my view, worked very closely with the US, and we have also rightly, in my view, over time, increasingly worked in terms and maintaining policy flexibility and a degree of independence of thinking and decision making, the more you integrate, is an interesting question that Brendan goes to and examines, and he highlights some issues there that are probably remain unaddressed. For instance, I'll give you a practical example. If the Australian Navy decides to send a frigate to operate for 3 months in Northeast Asia with a carrier group from the 7th Fleet, is that an operational decision or is it a policy decision? When I was in government, I actually saw a 4-sentence memo that was going to the Minister advising him that an Australian frigate was going off to be on deployment for 3 months with a US carrier group in Northeast Asia. And given that it had been done 4 years before, this was simply seen to be an operational matter that didn't require the Minister's approval. I, in fact, intervened in that, spoke to the Minister and said, look, I think this is a policy decision. If one of our frigates go off with a US carrier group into Northeast Asia, I don't have a problem with that, but ministers need to be aware of it because if that carrier group was required to do certain things, if tensions rose and if the carrier group was sent to different places, it would be almost impossible to extract the frigate from the carrier group without seriously damaging the alliance. Therefore, while I didn't have a problem with what was being proposed operationally, I thought there was a fundamental misunderstanding about what was operational and what was policy. And I think Brendan's chapter highlights those questions in the alliance, particularly given that we have not faced the pressures up till now in this part of the world as other parts of the world experienced during the Cold War. So I think Brendan's questions in respect of the alliance, in respect of escalation and the like of the issues that could arise in that setting, I think are very pertinent today. So with those few remarks, Professor and Ambassador, I'll leave it there, but very happy to take questions afterwards. But if I can say, I think this was one of Brendan's last academic contributions, and so I think those of you who knew Brendan, you should hold this book dear, and when you read his chapter like me, I think you'll probably have to read it 2 or 3 times, which simply reflects the depth of Brendan's thinking. Thank you.
Warm thanks, Dennis, for that really touching reflection and for channeling some of Brendan into our conversation today. We appreciate it very much. We do want to have the opportunity for conversation with our editors and contributors and panellists. And so we'll start now from the chair, and then I'll open up to you, our audience, in a little while. Let's go first to you, Oriana, joining us from the US, from a different vantage point. One of the things that all of us are acutely aware of right at the moment is the way in which Putin has signalled the potential for the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. As a China specialist, what do you think that signalling communicates to China? Does it increase the likelihood that China might consider using nuclear weapons in a future conflict?
perhaps with the United States or perhaps with another state? We'd welcome your thoughts.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you so much for having me. For some of you that don't know, I'm a wannabe, I guess, Australian citizen. I spent 14 months there during the pandemic. My husband and all my children are Australian citizens. I, because of my government service, will never be allowed to have dual nationality. But every day my 3-year-old asks me why baby chinos don't exist in the United States. It's only his long list of complaints of why the United States is inferior to Australia. So I really wish I could be joining you in person instead of from Stanford, California, but it's a real pleasure to be a part of this project. For those of you who don't know my work, I'll be very general and say that I'm relatively known as a China hawk. While I speak Chinese and spend a lot of time in Beijing, I do write a lot about the high propensity for conflict between the United States and China, in my view that China wants to displace the United States in Asia. That being said, I am less concerned than most about the potential for China's use of nuclear weapons than any contingency in Asia. I'm currently working on a whole book about how China can speak differently than the United States, in which I have a section on nuclear strategy. Now, people who are experts, functional experts on nuclear weapons, find it hard to understand that different states think differently about their potential military uses. But as a China expert, and someone, I think, with a deeper understanding of Chinese military capabilities and their training, I think the Chinese view that nuclear weapons are primarily there to defend against nuclear use, nuclear blackmail, is correct. Just as a starting point, China doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons like the United States does, which I think is a very costly, incredible demonstration that they don't believe they have a significant war-fighting role. Now that being said, in my contribution to this volume, I was asked to think of contingencies under which they might consider using nuclear weapons. Now I left out, I think, the extreme contingencies that maybe we have more consensus on. For example, if the United States were to pursue regime change in China, I think that would be a situation where you'd see a higher likelihood of nuclear use. Now, we might rule that out as a potential feasible scenario, but then we just heard President Biden basically make a regime change comment about Vladimir Putin. So you can never count on the United States to think sort of rationally about these things. So that's always a possibility. But in my contribution, I wanted to think of more likely scenarios. So I focused on the Taiwan contingency and the conditions under which China would be more willing to consider using nuclear weapons than others. And I created a sort of a typology in which I sort of look at two different factors. How did this war happen? And whether China escalated gradually or rapidly. Now, the why the war happened is basically, I've argued in other writings that China's considering initiating a conflict. So maybe they're more proactive. They themselves start the conflict. They also might be more reactive in that, Taiwan declares independence, they feel like they have to react to that. My bottom line assessment is, in most scenarios, China would not consider using nuclear weapons. The one that they're most likely to consider is one in which they had to react to a change in scenario. They didn't initiate themselves, and they started the war with rapid escalation. So it's such a high level of conflict that it didn't leave them a lot of room to escalate, to demonstrate their will and resolve in other areas. So I think there is a possibility in that scenario, but that being said, for friends and allies and partners, that nuclear use only makes sense against the United States. China has limited nuclear weapons, has limited delivery vehicles, and honestly speaking, their conventional capabilities against countries in the region are so significant that they themselves are deterred enough. The only way they can project power against the United States is through cyberspace and nuclear weapons. And so that's why I think they'd probably be holding on to this inventory for use against the United States. There's high trade-off if they consider using them in the region. So I guess the good news, from the Australian perspective, is that my bottom line assessment is I can't think of situations under which China would consider using nuclear weapons against Australia. Which also makes me happy that I bought an apartment in Australia. So in addition to anyone coughing next to me, if anything happens, I think I'm safer in Australia than I'm potentially here. So that is I'm happy to elaborate on any of those points, but that's the bottom line assessment of my contribution.
Thanks so much. That is a really rich response, and I'm sure that people will pick up on some of the themes in your remarks as we get deeper into the conversation. Before we go to other specific use examples, I wanted to give our editors a chance to reflect on the motivation behind the book and any general observations that they'd like to bring out of the project. So I might turn to you first, Andrew, and invite your reflections on your own very significant project and the volume that we're celebrating.
Thanks very much, Veronica. Really appreciate the opportunity to outline some of the motives, and I'm happy to pass to my co-editor too. Hopefully he has a similar view to me, but I guess that can't always be predicted. I'd say very quickly, I guess three kind of key motives for us. I mean, the first was we've all, I think, always been interested as sort of co-authors in the perspective of US allies on these issues rather than the US perspective, the perspective of the major power. How are these dynamics seen from the perspective of alliance partners of the United States? The second is, I guess, a little bit more, perhaps less generic, and it's more of a policy question, I guess, is can the Indo-Pacific discern lessons from the European experience? And we chose Indo-Pacific case studies and European case studies quite deliberately. We know that the Europeans have baked this into a lot of NATO planning over many decades, whereas in the Indo-Pacific, it's largely confined to bilateral dialogues between the US and the ROK and the US and Japan. The US and Australia don't have a kind of dedicated extended deterrence dialogue, although some of that does sort of spill over into broader alliance discussions. So can our region, I guess, learn from the European experience, both in terms of avoiding potential pitfalls, but also some of the advantages of having a more structured, institutionalised dialogue? And I guess thirdly, too, from the Australian dimension, how do we best navigate the challenges of what Dennis I think really described well before, that sort of balance between operational integration and policy flexibility. Are there lessons that we can garner from other allies in our region, but also further afield in Europe?
Thanks so much for that. Stefan, I'd like to invite you into the conversation, just to reflect first of all on general motivations and themes that you drew out of the project.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and greetings to everybody, and my thanks for all your attendance. I'm speaking to you from COVID isolation. Unfortunately, I would have liked to be able to attend in person, but I was late last week. So I think that just to kind of expand on what Andrew was saying, I think that there are three main takeaways that we identify from across the discussions in the book. That is that we think there is a need to expand from consultation about U.S. superior posture to terrorists, which often, I think in particular in the Indo-Pacific context, has been more about forming allies than generally consulting or actually joint policy development, to a more joint development of assessment, concept and planning for deterrence and escalation. And obviously here I think that there are some caution about what Andrew discussed, the European example insofar as that is obviously arising from a very particular institutional and historical kind of context that doesn't necessarily translate. But I think the value of having joint understanding of how escalation works and how we might manage escalation, for example, is I think something that's been demonstrated in the Ukraine example, where you have 30 allies in the face of a nuclear threat, still being able to agree on fairly dramatic steps to support Ukraine in a very short amount of time. And I think that you can see the value of having a joint understanding of escalation in possible way of managing that in that alliance. The second thing is that I think a second theme across the book is that there is a need for Indo-Pacific allies more systematically examine their own force structure and hardware, if you like, cooperation insofar as it's relevant for deterrence. What we mean by that is we don't think that there is a joint understanding, for example, of the strategic significance of long-range strikes, of the strategic significance of, for example, US tactical nuclear forces. How would they play into escalation management? What would be the political significance of, for example, dispersing American long-range strike forces in a crisis or not? Those are ultimately the shared understanding in which alliances can then manage crises and manage deterrence during crises that we need to build. And I think the third broad theme, again looking across all alliances, is that there is a need for governments to actively engage the population in this. Ultimately, we are, through alliances, trying to commit politically to entering conventional operations against nuclear power. We can only do that if governments are convinced that they have a way and understanding of how to manage the risk of escalation. And ultimately, populations need to understand this as well. So there is an element of which we need to start talking about escalation and the way that we can manage escalation, which also includes talking about the role of nuclear weapons in how we do that, rather than looking at nuclear weapons purely through a armament perspective, which I think has been the dominant theme in the official discourse of nuclear weapons for a number of years. So those are kind of some of the main takeaways that come from the discussion of 4 alliances in the book, each of which has very particular kind of approaches to the question.
Thanks very much. I must ask you, Stefan, and also Andrew, given that events have unfolded as they have and that Russia has now invaded Ukraine, does that affect any of your analysis? Is the book still salient? Is this something that you think that your analysis could have predicted and responded to?
I might have a first shot at that and then hand over to Stefan. I think there is a temptation at the moment, I think, to say, the intellectual literature has been sort of overtaken by empirical events. A lot of the theories that we've developed have been kind of left in their wake by what's happened in Europe. And I guess we could have a debate about whether deterrence worked, whether it was never enforced to begin with in the case of Putin and Ukraine because it's not a NATO member. I guess what I would say is that the point Stefan was making before about, an alliance of 30-odd countries being able to sort of push back against Russia in the current context, to use the phrase of Biden, defending every square inch of NATO and making it clear where those commitments begin and when they end in relation to Ukraine. That isn't just an accident. That's something that's been the product of decades, of institutionalisation in Europe in that alliance, and having keyed into defence planning a very strong political commitment to NATO as well. And I think there are lessons from that for our own region here and potentially for Australia as well about how you start to think through, can we institutionalise the relationship with the United States more effectively? Should we clarify understandings? Again, that sort of policy flexibility, operational integration dynamic. So I think it does have key lessons for us, and the book has key lessons for the current crisis.
Thanks so much. Stefan, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that you said. I just as a note of caution that on the one hand you're trying to the glass half full person, you see that as a success in many ways of the theme of the book, the arguments that we make are necessary. On the other hand, if you look at the Indo-Pacific and ultimately also Europe, to some extent what alliances need to achieve is not to avoid conflict with a nuclear power, but ultimately signal political commitment to enter conflict with a nuclear power over, for example, Taiwan. I mean, that's ultimately what we, I think, increasingly agree is required for strategic stability. So the question is, to what extent can we actually find ways and understandings between allies that the same caution that we are now seeing in the Ukraine case doesn't prevent from entering into a conflict if we, for example, commit to the defense of Taiwan. And I think that there is an argument here about the difference between what is an ally and what is a partner. Over the last 20 years, both categories were blurred to the point of indistinguishable, and I think that we're seeing very much the distinction between who is an ally and who is a partner now, ultimately not in Ukraine. But more often, with the absence of a multilateral alliance system, I think there's some very, very important kind of questions that we need to ask ourselves. How do we credibly manage, strategically and politically manage those, still be able to credibly extend deterrence to adversaries, but also to our own population?
Thanks so much. That's a good segue to also ask a similar question of you, Ambassador. In your remarks, you pointed to the empirical situation that Japan is surrounded by 3 nuclear powers. There is no Indo-Pacific binding consensus that constrains nuclear weapons. Japan is thoughtfully and deliberately building a discussion internally and domestically about what its deterrence posture and form should be. But could you say something about alliances and partners? Because Japan has both. So this is not entirely an empty space in which you're operating, and the nature of those alliances and partnerships has changed in recent years.
Well, on a lighter note, I always tell this to my Aussie colleagues. Japan has 3 nuclear, countries in our immediate neighborhood, whereas, in the case of Australia, you have only New Zealand. How lucky you guys are! But that said, I think this kind of security situation and deteriorating, year after year, is forcing us to think very, very carefully and wisely about what is needed. And certainly, alliance with the United States, comes first. But in this, complex world, we need something more. And with that, in our mind, we have, proceeded to, go along in promoting our so-called special strategic partnership with Australia. And Australia is not the only country. We have been expanding our defense security cooperation with other like-minded countries, including India, Britain, and France, and so on. So, coming back to your question, it's certainly important for us to have multi-layer or security mechanism guarantees, not only with alliance with Americans, but trilateral security cooperation, or Quad, is another example. In so doing, we can increase deterrence in the Pacific region, so that we can deter our counterparts or adversary from taking any adventurous measure.
Thank you so much. I think our audience has been waiting patiently, and so we're now going to invite...
Could I just add something to that?
Yep.
In terms of alliances and partners, let me say that I think over the last 18 months, the use of wording by commentators and others has got completely lost. And I'm not talking about technicalities here. For instance, how many times have you heard over the last 6 months about the Quad alliance? The Quad is not within a country mile of being an alliance. You can call it any number of other things, but it is not an alliance. You hear about the AUKUS alliance. It is not an alliance by any definition. So the wording that has crept into everyday use, I think, has distorted understanding of different countries. For instance, many Australians would have been surprised that India took the view it did in respect of Ukraine because of the use of the term Quad alliance. And you had the Australian media fretting over the fact that India took a different view to the other Quad members, yet anyone who has taken the most cursory interest in international relations over the last 40 years would not have expected India to respond any differently to the way it did. So the use of wording is important. We shouldn't throw the word alliance around loosely. It should be used only to mean the dictionary meaning of the word.
It's a great observation and a good caution too. Thanks so much.